informed me that sometimes the person who introduces speaks longer than he does. I assure you this isn't going to happen today. Students and faculty, friends of the University of Wisconsin, Madison County Center, honored guests, welcome to the third convocation of this year and to this opening program of Center Week. We have with us today a man of historical import, a man who, for many, is a symbol of the civil rights movement in America. We think that history will undoubtedly record him as the leader of this movement. Americans are particularly fortunate for this leadership. Dr. King holds firmly to the principle that nonviolent action is the right method in pursuing political, social, and economic revolution. In this regard, he follows the philosophy of the late Gandhi of India. How many of us think about a civil rights revolution in America where other types of leadership or methods might be used, like violent revolution? This is a pretty fearsome thought. Dr. King's achievements are many. We read about them in the newspaper. He is the youngest man to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. He's written much, but we know him most as a man of action, as the leader of civil rights demonstrations, often in hostile communities. We all remember the march from Selma to Montgomery. I doubt seriously that our speaker has thought much about his role in history. It appears he is concerned more about the things he believes he must do. In this, I think, lies his historical importance. It is an honor to introduce this man, ladies and gentlemen, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King.
Distinguished guests, members of the faculty, and members of the student body of this very fine institution of learning, ladies and gentlemen. I need not pause to say how very delighted I am to be here and to have the privilege of being part of your convocation series. I must apologize in the very beginning for being late today and for changing the arrangement that had been made some time ago. But yesterday, we tried to get out of Chicago only to discover that because of weather conditions, we could not get to Indiana, where I had been scheduled to speak for quite some time, and this necessitated changing my whole schedule, and I do want to express my great appreciation to you for your patience and your willingness to aid me in regulating my schedule in this somewhat difficult situation. We were late today because we encountered very strong headwinds as we flew in, and that gives another reason why I'm very happy to be here, because when we were getting ready to land, it was mighty choppy, and whenever I'm on a rather turbulent flight, I'm always happy to get on the ground. I don't want to give you the impression that as a Baptist preacher I don't have faith in God in the air. It's simply that I've had more experience with Him on the ground. I want to talk this afternoon from the subject, the future of integration. Victor Hugo said on one occasion that there is nothing more powerful in all the world than an idea whose time has come. There can be no gainsaying of the fact that the idea whose time has come today is the idea of freedom and human dignity. In the long and sometimes turbulent struggle to bring into full realization the idea of freedom and justice, we have made some significant strides. But we must also confess that we still have a long, long way to go before the problem of racial injustice is solved in our country. And so as I talk this afternoon about the future of integration, I would like to use this theme as a basis for our thinking together. We have come a long, long way, but we still have a long, long way to go. Now let us notice that we've come a long, long way. And I'd like to point out first that the Negro himself has come a long, long way in re-evaluating his own intrinsic worth. Now, in order to illustrate this, a little history is necessary. You will remember that it was in the year 1619 that the first Negro slaves landed on the shores of this nation. They were brought here from the soils of Africa. Unlike the Pilgrim Fathers who landed at Plymouth a year later, they were brought here in chains against their will. Throughout slavery, the Negro was treated in a very inhuman fashion. Famous Dred Scott decision of 1857 well illustrated the status of the Negro during slavery. In this decision, the Supreme Court of our nation ruled that the Negro was not a citizen of the United States. He was merely property subject to the dictates of his owner. And it went on to say that the Negro has no right, that the white man is bound to respect. With the growth of slavery, it became necessary to give some justification for it. It seems to be a fact of life that human beings cannot continue to do wrong without eventually reaching out for some thin rationalization to clothe an obvious wrong in the beautiful garments of righteousness. This is exactly what happened during the days of slavery. Even the Bible and religion were used, or I should say misused, to justify the system of slavery. So from some pulpits it was argued that the Negro was inferior by nature because of Noah's curse upon the children of Ham. The Apostle Paul's dictum became a watchword: servants, be obedient to your master. And then one brother had probably read the logic of the great philosopher Aristotle. As you know, Aristotle did a good deal to bring into being what we now know as formal logic in philosophy, and In formal logic, you have a syllogism, which has a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. And so this brother decided to put his argument of the inferiority of the Negro in the framework of an Aristotelian syllogism. He came out with his major premise, all men are made in the image of God. Then came his minor premise, God, as everybody knows, is not a Negro, therefore the Negro is not a man. This was the kind of reasoning that prevailed. But living with the system of slavery and all of its evils and all of its oppression, and then living later with racial segregation, many Negroes lost faith in themselves. Many came to feel that they were inferior, that they were less than human. But then something happened to the Negro. Circumstances made it possible and necessary for him to travel more. The coming of the automobile, the upheavals of 2 world wars, the Great Depression. And so his rural plantation background gradually gave way to urban industrial life. His cultural life was gradually rising through the steady decline of crippling illiteracy. He watched with his own eyes the drama of independence taking place on the stage of African history. Gained a great deal of self-respect as a result of that. And all of these things conjoined to cause the Negro to take a new look at himself. Negro masters all over began to reevaluate themselves. The Negro came to feel that he was somebody. His religion revealed to him that God loves all of his children and that all men are made in his image. That the basic thing about a man is not his specificity, but his fundamentals. Not the texture of his hair or the color of his skin, but his eternal dignity and worth. So the Negro could now unconsciously cry out with the eloquent poet, fleecy locks and black complexion cannot forfeit nature's claim. Skin may differ, but affection dwells in black and white the same. If I were so tall as to reach the pole or to grasp the ocean at a span, I must be measured by my soul. The mind is the standard of the man. With this new sense of dignity, this new sense of self-respect, this new sense of manhood, a new Negro came into being with a new determination to struggle, to suffer and sacrifice in order to be free. So we've come a long, long way since 1619. But not only has the Negro himself come a long, long way in re-evaluating his own intrinsic worth, we are true to the facts. We must point out that the whole nation has made significant strides in the area of civil rights. Time will not permit me to point out all of the strides made. But probably the most visible stride that we have made, the thing that we can all see, is that in our day and in our generation, we have seen the walls of legal segregation all over the South crumble. For many years, we were forced to live with this humiliating, unjust system. This was backed up by a decision from the United States Supreme Court. In 1896, the Supreme Court rendered a decision known as the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, which established a doctrine of separate but equal as the law of the land. As a result of this blessed doctrine, the Negro ended up being plunged anew into the abyss of exploitation, where he experienced the bleakness of nagging injustice. Something else happened. It was on May 17th, 1954. The Supreme Court of the nation rendered a new decision, the Brown decision. After examining the legal body of segregation for many, many months, the Supreme Court pronounced it constitutionally dead. It said in substance that the old blessed doctrine must go, that separate facilities are inherently unequal, and that to segregate a child on the basis of his race is to deny that child equal protection of the law. After that, several other developments took place. We finally brought the nation to the point of passing a comprehensive civil rights bill in 1964 after the Birmingham movement, after the Selma movement, where we dramatized the whole question of the denial of the right to vote. We were able to bring into being the kind of climate that caused the Congress to pass the 1965 Voting Rights Bill. So we've seen, as a result of all of these developments, a breakdown in the system of legal segregation. And I am absolutely convinced that legal segregation is as dead as a doornail. And the only thing uncertain about it is how costly some of our friends, like former Governor Wallace and others, will make the funeral. We've come a long, long way since 1896. Now, this would be a wonderful place for me to end my speech this afternoon. First, it would mean making a short speech, and that would be a magnificent accomplishment for a Baptist preacher. Secondly, it would mean that the problem is just about solved now, and we really have nothing to do and nothing to worry about or to deal with. It would be a wonderful thing if speakers all over our country could talk about the race problem in terms of a problem that once existed but that no longer has existence. But you see, if I stop at this point, I will merely be stating a fact and not telling the truth. You see, a fact is merely the absence of contradiction, but truth is the presence of coherence. Truth is the relatedness of facts. Now, it's a fact that we've come a long, long way, but it isn't the whole truth. And if I stop at this point, I will leave you the victims of an illusion wrapped in superficiality, and we can all go away the victims of a dangerous optimism. So in order to tell the truth, I must move on and say that we still have a long, long way to go before the problem of racial injustice is solved in our country. Now, we don't have to look very far to see this. We need only turn on our televisions or read our newspapers or look around in our various communities. We see every day that the problem of racial injustice is still with us. Racism is still the Negro's burden and America's shame. We see it expressed in its overt violent forms in some instances. There are some places in our country today where the murder of Negroes and white civil rights workers is still a popular pastime. In the state of Mississippi, for instance, since 1963, some 48 Negroes and civil rights workers have been brutally murdered. Not a single person has been convicted for these dastardly crimes. There have been some indictments here and there, but not a single conviction. In Mississippi also, in the last 2 years, 52 Negro churches have been burned to the ground. Nothing has been done about it. Seems that they have a new motto down there, not attend the church of your choice, but burn the church of your choice. And oh, how tragic this is. All of these things tell us that we still have a long, long way to go. But that isn't the only kind of violence existing in our nation. Physical violence is bad enough. There are millions of people in our country who are being lynched, murdered psychologically and spiritually every day because of the conditions that they face and that they must live with. They live in the ghettos of our nation. They live in rat-infested, vermin-filled slums, so that some 50% of the Negro citizens of this country live in substandard housing conditions. They find themselves forced to attend segregated, inadequate, overcrowded schools. By the thousands every year, Negro boys and girls are finishing high school reading at a 6th and 8th grade level, not because they are dumb, not because they don't have native intelligence, but because the schools are so inferior, so inadequate, so devoid of quality, so segregated. The best in these minds and the real potentials never come out. This is what we see in so many instances in all of our major cities. Much more money is spent per student in suburban schools, for instance, and in predominantly white schools than in predominantly Negro schools in the ghetto. So inferior conditions persist. Then that is a tragic economic problem. Negro finds himself still perishing on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. When we think of the unemployment rate in the Negro community, I would just like to remind you that it's a depression problem. Statistics reveal that about the unemployment rate in the nation as a whole is about 4%. The Labor Department says it's about 8.2% in the Negro community. Now these are Negroes who are in the labor market, who once had jobs, who are still going to employment offices to find jobs, and they have a way to calculate that or to get the statistics on it, but it doesn't include what we call the discouraged person, people who have lost hope, who see life as a long and desolate corridor with no exit sign, who've knocked on so many doors and they've been closed in their faces and they feel defeated and so they give up. Sometimes they try to escape by becoming alcoholics or dope addicts. But they've lost hope and faith and everything else. When you look in the discouraged category, there are those who estimate that that's another 7 or 8%, which means the unemployment rate in the Negro community is around 16 or 17%. This means that the Negro is confronting a major depression in his everyday life. If the nation as a whole had an unemployment rate comparable to what the Negro is confronting, we would face a major depression more staggering and the Depression of the late 20s and 30s. This tells us something of what is happening. It's not only unemployment that we have as a problem, it's underemployment. The interesting thing is that most of the Negroes who are poverty-stricken are working every day, but earning so little money, they cannot begin to gain the basic necessities of life. This has made for a great deal of frustration, for a great deal of despair in the Negro community. This is coupled with the fact that the progress is often getting slower. I was just reading today where the House Appropriations Committee cut the requested allocation for the Model Cities program and for the Rent Supplement program. Both programs that would greatly aid the poor, greatly aid in dealing with the blight of our cities. I noticed today where the House Appropriations Committee cut it more than a half, left just about a third of what the administration requested. And I see this kind of development as an open invitation on the part of the Congress of our nation for riots to occur repeatedly in the ghettos of our nation. It only exacerbates the tension. It only increases the frustration. It only deepens the despair. I will continue to say with all of my might that riots are wrong, that riots are self-defeating, that riots are socially destructive. No, I stand in sadness every time I see my brothers and sisters helplessly engaging in riots and the kind of misguided anger expressed in it. Therefore, I will continue to preach that nonviolence is the most potent weapon available to the Negro in his struggle for freedom and justice in America. Yet as I condemn riots, I must be as vigorous in condemning the conditions which continue to exist in our society, the conditions that cause people to feel that they have no other alternative but to engage in such misguided activity to get attention. A riot is the language of the unheard. What is it that America has failed to hear? It has failed to hear that the plight of the Negro poor has worsened over the last 15 years. It has failed to hear that the promises of freedom and justice have not been met. It has failed to hear that large segments of white society are more concerned about tranquility and the status quo than about justice, equality, and humanity. And so our nation's summers of riots are caused by our nation's winters of delay. And so long as we postpone justice, as long as we fail to implement the great promises of our democracy, then we are in danger of having our cities in this kind of tension and turbulence that we've seen over the last few summers. I would like to suggest for the moments left some of the things that must be done, some of the things that we as individuals can do to make the American dream a reality and move on toward the goal of integration. First, let me mention the need for massive action programs all over our country to solve the problem. there are those who don't recognize the need for action. They tend to feel that the problem will work itself out, and they go on with the illusion that there is something in the very structure of things that will automatically rectify the evils of the past. Now, history is a long story of the fact that there is no truth in this. Freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed and the allies of the oppressed. And so action programs are necessary, and this means that we've got to get rid of one or two myths if we are going to really develop the kind of action program necessary. One is what I often refer to as the myth of time. I'm sure you've heard this notion. It is the notion that only time can solve the problem. Therefore, you must wait on time. I know I've heard this a great deal. There are those people, and they're often sincere, who say to us in the civil rights movement and to our allies in the white community, you're pushing things too fast, just be nice, just be patient and continue to pray, and in 100 or 200 years the problem will work itself out. Well, I think there is an answer to that myth. It is that time is neutral. It can be used either constructively or destructively. And I'm absolutely convinced that the forces of ill will in our nation, the extreme rightists of our nation, the forces committed to negative ends in our nation, have often used time much more effectively than the forces of goodwill, and it may well be that we will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the violence of the bad people, but for the silence of the good people, for the indifference of those who go around and say, wait on time. Somewhere we must come to see that human progress never rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. Comes through the tireless efforts and the persistent work of dedicated individuals, and without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the forces of social stagnation. So we must help time, realize that the time is always right to do right. Now, the other myth that gets around a good deal, north and south, is the notion that legislation can't solve the problem. That legislation really can't do anything to make conditions better or to make justice a reality for oppressed people and for poor people, for Negro people. And we hear this over and over again. I was reading some of it in Chicago yesterday. The House, fortunately, the state of Illinois passed an open housing bill, and now it's going before the Senate in the state legislature, and one of the brothers came out with a familiar argument that you can't deal with the housing problem through legislation because you got to change the heart. So certainly we've got to change the heart, and I would be the first to say that if we are going to have a truly integrated society, the hearts of men must be changed. White persons must treat Negroes right, not merely because the law says it, but because it's right to do it, because the Negro is his brother. I would be the first to say that if we are to have a great society, men and women must rise to the majestic heights of being obedient to the unenforceable. So I recognize that the heart must be changed. But after saying this, let me point out the other side. While it may be true that morality cannot be legislated, behavior can be regulated. It may be true that the law cannot change the heart, but it can restrain the heartless. It may be true that the law can't make a man love me, but it can restrain him from lynching me, and I think that's pretty important also. So while the law may not change the hearts of men, it does change the habits of men. When you begin to change the habits of men, pretty soon attitudes will begin to change, hearts will begin to change. And I submit that there is a need right now for genuine, powerful civil rights legislation in every state in our country, whether it's on the question of housing. There is a fair housing bill before our Congress now. Unfortunately, and sadly, I must say that I think it's going down the drain once more because we have hypocrites in our nation. The interesting thing is that there will be northern, western, midwestern congressmen voting against it very strongly. They are the same ones that often voted for civil rights legislation when it applied to the South. They voted in 64. Senator Dirksen voted in 64 and 65. But when it started talking about housing, that's unconstitutional, he said, to have legislation on that, because that applied to Illinois, that applied to Wisconsin, that applied to California, that applied to New York, that applied to Pennsylvania. It wasn't just on the South. So we have seen this kind of hypocrisy developing over and over again. And I am sad to say that we probably won't get this civil rights legislation in this session of Congress. It just means a further weakening of our commitment to democracy. Now there's another myth that gets around a great deal, and that is an overemphasis on the bootstrap philosophy. There are those who contend that the Negro must do the job all by himself. The Negro's not doing enough for themselves. Now certainly we stress the need for self-help programs, and there are some things that the Negro can only do for himself. I recognize that. The Negro is to be totally free. He's got to feel a sense of personhood, a sense of somebodyness. He cannot be ashamed of his history. He must not be ashamed of his color. He must not be ashamed of his hair or anything about him. He must recognize that he's as beautiful as anybody else, and he's got to believe it in his soul, and nobody else can do this for him. The Negro must do it for himself. For years, the Negro hated himself in so many instances, was ashamed of his heritage, ashamed of his color, because the nation made his color stigma. Now the Negro is asserting powerfully the kind of dignity and pride that's necessary. More and more this must be done, and nobody else can do this for the Negro. He's to be truly free. He must do this for himself, and there's a great deal that we can do in pooling our economic and political resources in order to move on in the days ahead. Then after this, we must see the problems facing our communities are far too huge for the Negro to solve them by himself. A man asked me on the plane some time ago, just about 2 weeks ago, Dr. King, every time I see you all, you are marching and you are demonstrating and you are talking about the problem of racism and the problem of racial injustice. Why don't you do something for yourselves? Because he didn't think marching was doing anything for yourself, I guess. But anyway, he went on. He said, now other immigrant groups have come to this country with the same problem. He went on to say that they pulled themselves up, the Irish, the Italians, he went right down, immigrant groups from Europe mainly. And I looked at that man and I said to myself, it doesn't help the Negro for unfeeling, insensitive people to say to him, people who came to this country 100 or 150 years ago voluntarily, gotten ahead of him, and he's been here 348 years, and he came in chains. And I wanted to say to this man, it's so unfeeling, it's so insensitive. Sir, do you know that there is not another ethnic group that has been a slave on American soil? I wanted to say to him, sir, do you realize that this country made the Negro's color a stigma? He could never hide from that. Then I wanted to remind him that this nation freed the Negro from slavery in 1863 through the Emancipation Proclamation. It didn't give him any land to cultivate. He was left there penniless, illiterate, nowhere to go, nothing to do. And at that same moment, America was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest. It was willing to undergird its white peasants from Europe with an economic floor by which they could rise and develop, and refused to give any kind of base to its Negro black peasants from Africa. On the Statue of Liberty, we read that America is the mother of exile. But it doesn't take us long to realize that America has not been a mother to its black exiles from Africa. It hadn't had that maternal concern. That is why the Negro in one of his sorrow songs could sing, nobody knows the trouble I see on the one hand. On the other hand, sometimes I feel like a motherless child. And so if we are to solve the problems in the days ahead, the nation must realize that the Negro has been crippled by the centuries, and something special has to be done to deal with the economic, social problems confronting the vast majority of Negroes in our country. It's a wonderful thing to say to one, lift yourself by your own bootstraps, but it's a cruel jest to say to a bootless man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. The fact is that millions of Negroes have been left bootless as a result of centuries of denial, centuries of neglect, and centuries of hurt. What is needed now for the nation to spend billions of dollars to get rid of poverty, to get rid of slums, to get rid of bad educational conditions. It will take just that to solve the problems in all of our cities today. The gains that we've made so far were obtained at bargain rates. It didn't cost the nation anything to integrate lunch counters. It didn't cost the nation anything to integrate public accommodations. It didn't cost the nation anything to guarantee the right to vote. Now we've reached a point in the civil rights revolution where we are saying that there has to be a radical redistribution of economic and political power. We're also saying that the nation will have to spend billions of dollars to deal with all of these problems. And I think one of the programmatic answers to the problem is a guaranteed annual income. And I think the movement will organize people in the ghettos toward dramatizing the issue, thereby leading the nation to see the necessity of a guaranteed annual income for every American family. Now we have the resources to do all I'm talking about. The question is whether our nation has the will. Now it's going to mean reordering our priorities, but we have the resources. Our national gross product this year will rise to the astounding figure of $780 billion. We are the richest, most powerful nation in the world. If we would just allocate 3% of our national gross product over the 10-year period, get rid of the blight of our cities, to make opportunities a reality for the 40 million poor people of our country, we could end poverty in that period. Not a question of resources, it is a question of will. And I say to you this afternoon, if our nation can spend $35 billion a year to fight an ill-considered, what I consider unjust war in Vietnam, and $20 billion to put a man on the moon, it can spend billions of dollars to put God's children on their own 2 feet here on earth. This is a great challenge. Let me say just another thing, which I guess is more in the realm of the spirit and the real sense of brotherhood. As we go on in the days ahead, Negroes and white persons of this country must realize the commonality of their destinies. We are all tied together in a single garment of destiny. Now, the racists don't believe this. They don't realize this. But the fact is that whether they realize it or whether anybody else realizes it or not, we are all tied together. The Negro needs the white man to free him from his fear. The white man needs the Negro to save him from his guilt. We are tied together now. Our music, our language, our material prosperity, and even our food are an amalgam of black and white, culturally and otherwise. Every white person is a little bit Negro. Every Negro is a little bit white. So there is no separate black path to power and fulfillment that does not intersect white roots. That is no separate white path to power and fulfillment short of social disaster. It does not recognize the need of sharing that power with black aspirations for freedom and justice. Yes, we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. John Donne placed it in graphic terms: no man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continental part of the main. And he goes on toward the end to say, any man's death diminishes me because I'm involved in mankind. Therefore never sin to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. And so, in a real sense, white America can never be what it ought to be until black America is what it ought to be. It is just as simple as that. In the days ahead, if we as a nation recognize that, we will be able to transform dark yesterdays into bright tomorrows. Indeed, it's going to take a kind of divine discontent. You know, there are certain technical words in every academic discipline that soon become stereotypes and cliches. Every academic discipline has its technical nomenclature. Modern psychology has a word that is used more than any other word in psychology. It is the word maladjusted. I'm sure all of you have seen and dealt with that word. And we all want to live the well-adjusted life in order to avoid neurotic and schizophrenic personalities. But I must say to you this afternoon, my friends, that there are some things in our nation and in the world to which I'm proud to be maladjusted, to which I call upon all people of goodwill to be maladjusted until the good society is realized. I never intend to adjust myself to racial segregation and discrimination. I never intend to adjust myself to religious bigotry. I never intend to adjust myself to the madness of militarism and the self-defeating effects of physical violence. For in a day when Sputniks and explorers and Geminis are dashing through outer space, and guided ballistic missiles are carving highways of death through the stratosphere, no nation can win a war. It is no longer the choice between violence and nonviolence. It is not a choice between nonviolence and non-existence, and the alternative to disarmament, the alternative to a greater suspension of nuclear tests, the alternative to strengthening the United Nations and thereby disarming the whole world, the alternative to a negotiated settlement of that tragic conflict in Vietnam, may well be a civilization plunged into the abyss of annihilation, and our earthly habitat will be transformed into an inferno that even the mind of Dante could not envision. It may well be that our world is in dire need of a new organization now, the International Association for the Advancement of Creative Maladjustment, men and women who will be as maladjusted as the prophet Amos. Maladjusted as the prophet Amos, who in the midst of the injustices of his day, the crowd in words that echo across the centuries, let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. Maladjusted as Abraham Lincoln, who had the vision to see that this nation could not survive half slave and half free. Maladjusted as Thomas Jefferson, who in the midst of an age amazingly adjusted to slavery, but etch across the pages of history words lifted to cosmic proportions. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Maladjusted as Jesus Christ, who could say, "He who lives by the sword will perish by the sword." Through such maladjustment, you may be able to emerge from the bleak and desolate midnight of man's inhumanity to man into the bright and glittering daybreak of freedom and justice. Now may I say in conclusion that I haven't lost faith in the future. I've tried this afternoon to outline the problem and to make it clear that we still have a long way to go. But I haven't lost faith. While things are taking place too slowly, while we still see resistance and opposition, and there's always the so-called white backlash, these things are always around to discourage us. But I still believe that we are going to develop a coalition of conscience right here in this country to go on in the days ahead to solve the problem. Yes, we are going to achieve our freedom right here, because however much America strays away from it, the goal of America is freedom. Abused and scorned though we may be as a people, our destiny is tied up with the destiny of America. Before the Pilgrim Fathers landed at Plymouth, we were here. Before Jefferson wrote the words that I just uttered in the Declaration of Independence, we were here. Before the beautiful words of the Star-Spangled Banner were written, we were here. For more than 2 centuries, our forebears labored here without wages. They made cotton kings. They built the homes of their masters in the midst of the most humiliating and oppressive conditions. Yet out of a bottomless vitality, they continue to grow and develop. If the inexpressible cruelties of slavery couldn't stop us, the opposition that we now face, including the so-called white backlash, will surely fail. We're going to win our freedom because both the sacred heritage of our nation and the eternal will of the Almighty God are embodied in our echoing demands. So I can still sing the theme song of our movement, We Shall Overcome. We shall overcome because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. We shall overcome because Carlyle is right, no lie can live forever. We shall overcome because William Cullen Bryant is right, truth crushed to earth will rise again. We shall overcome because James Russell Lowell is right, truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. Yet that scaffold sways the future. And so with this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. This faith, we will transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. And we will speed up the day when all of God's children all over this vast land, white men and black men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last. Thank you. Yeah, tested 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We'll have to limit this for just about 10 or 12 minutes, if you don't mind. I don't have an open statement or whatever question is.
Dr. King, why did you choose to come to Wausau and some of the northern Wisconsin communities? Certainly there are no civil rights problems there.
I don't know the problems of the local community here. I make it a practice to speak in as many schools, as many colleges and universities as I can in the course of the year. And this is a practice I've followed over the last several years. And I choose them on the basis of convenience of travel and location often. It so happens that we've been working in Chicago a year or so, and I've spoken more in colleges in this area because it's been easier to get to. But I don't know about the racial situation in this area of Wisconsin. It was not for that reason at all, but just to visit and to speak to the students and faculty and
Dr. King, Senator Brooks of Massachusetts was quoted this morning as saying that Dr. Martin Luther King has to confine himself to a smaller number of movements or he will lose the people who are backing him. Any comment?
Well, I've heard this so often that I don't pay much attention to that. I don't believe in segregation. I've fought against segregation at lunch counters and hotels and motels. And I'm going to certainly fight against segregating my moral concern. I'm not going to limit my moral concern to one area of life. If I see immorality anywhere, I'm going to take a stand against it. And that doesn't mean a mechanical merger of movements. I've never advocated a mechanical merger of the civil rights and the peace movement. I've advocated simply that we infuse the peace movement with the fervor and the spirit of the civil rights movement. And I feel that that's needed now because, in my mind, this war is so clearly unjust and is destroying so many of the values that we hold dear in this country that if it isn't ended, it can completely poison the soul of our nation. And consequently, I will have to continue to do that. If I lose my followers, I'll just have to lose them. When you have to look at an issue like this, cowardice asks the question, is it safe? Expediency asks the question, is it politics? And of course, vanity asks, is it popular? But conscience asks the question, is it right? And I follow the dictates of my conscience, and it may be taking a stand on something that's neither safe, nor politic, nor popular. But you do it because you must, because it is right. And therefore, I can go with Senator Brooks' suggestion in any way.
Dr. King, in your address this afternoon, you said in the last 15 years, the plight of the Negro had gotten worse. You mean it's now going downhill again? It was better than it is now?
Economically, it is. As you know, or probably know, 20, 25 years ago, the unemployment rate among Negroes was about the same as the unemployment rate among whites. Now, more than 2 Negroes are unemployed to every 1 white. It's almost moving now to the point of being 3 to 1. So the gulf has widened. And as a result of automation and cybernation, jobs are still being lost every day. And this doesn't only mean where the Negro is concerned, there are many other poor people. But the Negro is still the poorest of the poor, and this is why we say that his economic plight has worsened, even on the point of the median income of the Negro family is less today in terms of comparison with the median income of whites than it was 15 years ago. We have had some real progress economically and job-wise within the Negro middle class, but that's still a very small number. The masses of Negroes are economically worse off today than they were 15 or 20 years ago. Even though the median income of the Negro is a little larger, the median income of the white family has grown. It's almost like one automobile going 80 miles an hour and another one going 60. And that one going 60 just never catches up, even though it's moving. But it's still behind, and this is where we find ourselves economically. Any other?
Dr. King, I've heard reports that your civil rights movement might move more north than it has, even north of Chicago. Does that mean you're going to be coming into Wisconsin more than you have?
No, I have no plans at this time to come into Wisconsin. We are considering some other communities in the north. The problem is that we have limited resources, limited hands, limited staff, and we have to try to continue our work in the South as well as meet needs in some of the northern communities. It may be that we will go into another northern community this summer and continue our work in Chicago, but we haven't made that decision. Our major time will be spent in Chicago again this summer.
Would the Negro population determine where you will go? For instance, in some of the northern Wisconsin communities, there is almost non-existent Negro population. Would that make any difference?
Well, I think right now it would make a difference. I think that our biggest job would have to be in communities now where you have Negroes in large numbers. Most Negroes now live in our cities. Some 92% of the Negroes of our country live in cities rather than rural areas. And 25% of the Negroes of America live in about 5 cities. And then it gets up to 50% when you add another 6 or 7 cities to that. So the more than 50% of the Negroes in America live in about 10 cities. Now, here we have our greatest concentration: New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, Detroit, Cleveland. And we will have to concentrate our efforts in these cities first, because this is where you have your largest problem, because of the large number of Negroes there and all of the conditions that they face as a result of discrimination and racism. Yes.
Dr. King, do you forecast a long, hot summer racial unrest?
Well, I don't like to put it that way because it gives the impression that I'm predicting violence, and I always hate to be in that position because I hate violence so much. I would hate to think of the riots of our cities, but honesty compels me to admit that things don't look too bright. The conditions that brought the riots into being last summer are still alive. Cities haven't done anything much about them. And frustrations are as deep. I get around these communities, I find deep bitterness because of the slow pace, of the slow progress, the continuing battles to just get one victory. City halls are not responsive enough, and this makes for great confusion and despair. And I'm afraid that as a result of this, we're going to see some very difficult and explosive situations in many of our cities.
Why are you talking?
That's right.
Why are you talking for unjust?
Well, I guess it's a long story, but I'll mention this 2 or 3 reasons why I think it is. First, I think it violates the UN Charter. We joined that great body, and we should have been true to it. One of the things that it says is that it must be reported to the Security Council when there's an act of aggression against a member nation, and the Security Council determines whether it is an act of aggression and determines the action that is to be taken. We bypass the United Nations. It's an undeclared war. Congress of our union, of our nation, has not declared this war, and that's clearly a constitutional mandate. But something even more basic, it seems to me, makes it an unjust war, and that is that we are fighting against the self-determination of the people. The war in Vietnam is basically a civil war. Vietnam came into being not as a communist group, as many people try to say. It was born in the South as a resistance movement to one of the most oppressive dictators in the history of the world, named Diem. The North didn't start sending supplies or troops in until we escalated our activity and our troops. Dr. Bernard Paul, who certainly one of the great authorities on Southeast Asia and Vietnam, says that in one of his books, less than 25% of the Viet Cong is communist. These are just people motivated by a principle of self-determination. The revolutions in the world today are basically motivated or animated by nationalism, not communism. It's just so tragic that our country live with this huge miscalculation so long about communism, a morbid sickness about communism. And this is why we continually made these mistakes. And I think that the greatest damage that we've done is to violate the Geneva Accord. We participated in sabotaging that accord. And that accord stated that in 1956, the election, we participated in blocking the election, supported Diem in doing it, and we had our troops right back there. And I could go on to mention other things about what this war has done to civil rights by diverting attention from it, what it has done to the poverty program, great society, and above all, it is a threat to the survival of mankind. It has increased the armaments race. It has increased the prospects of nuclear war and thereby the prospects of the annihilation of mankind. I am afraid that we are moving dangerously towards World War III. And if that happens, I can assure you that we are in a situation where nobody will win, and possibly everybody will be destroyed. This is why I feel that not only is this war unjust, but it's just impractical. And we've got to find some way to get out of that situation. It's hard for a nation to admit that it made an error, and I realize this. I think it was an error, it was a miscalculation, as I said. And it's very unfortunate that we got in it, but we don't have to stay in it. We have enough power as a nation to take the initiative in de-escalating that war. Our security would not be involved at all. It wouldn't hurt our prestige in the world. I'm not saying we should unilaterally withdraw, because that would be unrealistic to expect a nation to do it. I wouldn't see anything wrong with that, but I just know the nation isn't going to do it. So I call for other things. See, when France unilaterally withdrew from Algeria, it did not hurt France. If anything, it increased her prestige in the world. So it wouldn't hurt us to withdraw unilaterally, but I know we aren't going to do it. Consequently, I advocate such things as advocated by you, Trump, the Secretary General of the United Nations, such as ceasing the bombings and other things that will create the atmosphere for a negotiated settlement.
Dr. King,
this is
one
last
question.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that you often take stand because of conflict. What kind of a strain does this place on the family along with the
Oh, it's great strain on my family in the sense that I don't get to see them enough, and they don't get to see me enough. I have to go all the time trying to do this work in various communities. But fortunately, I have a very sympathetic family. My wife is a marvelous co-worker and agrees with me absolutely on what I'm doing, and she helps me do it. And she does a marvelous job of interpreting it to the children. Of course, I always spend the weekends with them. I usually get back to Atlanta every Saturday. And I'm preaching in my pulpit 3 Sundays a month. So that keeps me pretty close on the weekend. But they share, my wife shares my views. And we are good enough parents to seek to indoctrinate our children also on our views.
Shake your hand.
Yes, how do you do? Glad to see you. How do you